Good day, everyone. I'm Shira Lensei Tidasera, a student taking up Masters of Science in Education with specialization in physical sciences. And today I will be presenting to you our topic entitled Evolution. Evolution. But before we dig deeper in our discussion, let us first have the definition. Evolution, according to Merriam Webster, is the process by which new species or populations of living things develop from pre existing forms through successive generations. In short, this is descent with modification from pre existing species. Now, we have six subtopics for our discussion. First is historical perspective on evolution. Second is Darwin's voyage. Third, Darwin's theory. Evolution occurs by natural selection. Evidence supporting the theory of evolution, the modern synthesis, and lastly, the central role of evolution in modern biology. Let us have these first two topics to focus on: historical perspective on evolution and Darwin's voyage. Our objective is describe the major ideas in evolution and related topics that had a significant influence on Charles Darwin as he developed the concept of evolution by natural selection. Now, under historical perspective, we have divine design and perfection model, fossils, acquired traits, modern geology, Lyell uniformitarianism, and the ancient Earth, artificial selection, and population limits. For years, we have been wondering about how organisms have been evolving. These ideas have been made into theories by certain people. We have first Linnaeus or Carolus Linnaeus. He focused on classification, or what we all know now as taxonomy. Next is James Newton in gradual geologic change. He believed that Earth is much older than what was perceived during those times. Next is John Baptiste Lamarck on species can change or acquired traits or acquired inheritance. Next is Thomas Malthus, who is an English economist, which focused on population limits. Next is George Cuvier about fossils and extinction. We have Charles Lyell about modern geology. And we have Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace for evolution and natural selection. Under historical perspective, we have divine design and perfection model, which was the ideas dominated most thinking on biology, which is under Aristotle during the Renaissance. And we have species were viewed on a scale from simple to complex, which was considered more perfect. Simple to complex, and the complex is considered more perfect. All organisms were seen as moving toward perfection. Thus, divine design and perfection model is viewed as supernatural and outside the true realm of science. Now, it is discredited in biology, but still part of social consciousness. Next is we have fossils. Fossils, according to Merriam-Webster, is a remnant, impression, or a trace of an organism of past geologic ages that has been preserved in Earth's crust. Fossils were known for centuries before Darwin. Fossils reveal organisms unlike any living today. The idea that some fossils represent species that had become extinct was recognized even as early as Leonardo da Vinci. Now, this is a drawing of a giant ground sloth known as Mylodon. Next is birth of modern geology. We have Lyell, uniformitarianism, and the ancient Earth. Prior to the early 1800s, the worldview of most was that the Earth is very young, around 6,000 years old. Now, in the early 1800s, geologists began to apply scientific reasoning to studies of geological processes and quickly recognized that these processes require that the Earth be very old, billions of years to naturally occur or to occur naturally. Charles Lyell believed that the phenomena that shaped the world millions of years ago continue to occur today. That is why it is impossible that the Earth would only be around 6,000 years old. So, Charles Lyell believed, together with James Newton, they believed that the Earth is much older than 6,000 years old. Instead, it would be billions of years old. Next is this uniformitarian model of geological processes was made famous by Lyell's principles of geology, which influenced Charles Darwin. The uniformitarian model is essentially the basis of geology today. Confirming tests of this model include dating rocks using radioisotope ratios. More on that later. Next is we have the acquired traits, mostly associated with Lamarck or John Baptiste Lamarck, still focused on a model of organisms driven towards complexity, but involved an explanation with natural causes. He postulated that changes or acquired characteristics during an organism's life could be passed on to offspring. Famous example was Lamarck's model for how giraffes develop long necks. He claimed that stretching of the neck of one generation would lead to offspring with longer necks. Understanding of genetic inheritance has led to rejection of the acquired traits model. In this model, John Baptiste Lamarck believed that if parents um, stretched or acquired a trait by stretching their neck, specifically in giraffes, to reach tall trees and eat their leaves, then the offspring would also acquire the traits because it would be passed down from parents to the offspring. But technically, this is not the case. So, it was um, later viewed and rejected in the genetic inheritance models. Next is we have Darwin's voyage. In 1831, Charles Darwin, at the age of 22, leaves on Beagle or the HMS Beagle. And after 5 years, by 1836, the Beagle returns to England. Soon afterwards, writes his story of the trip and begins his secret notebooks. By 1838, he read Malthus' essay on the principles of population, and by 1839, Voyage of the Beagle was published. And by 1842, he made a 35-page sketch of theory, and 1844 expanded the sketch to 230 pages. In 1859, he published the book entitled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And by 1871, he publishes The Descendant of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. Now, this is a picture of Charles Darwin together with his sister Catherine. And this is the list of Charles Darwin's father's objections to the Beagle's voyage. Next is this is the quarter inside the HMS Beagle. And this is the HMS Beagle in the Strait of Magellan. Now, Charles Darwin started his journey in the HMS Beagle starting from Europe, or specifically in England. Then he went straight to South America, and then until he circumnavigate the globe. This is a picture of the Galapagos finches, which shows subtle differences on one kind of the finches, and technically all the finches had different characteristics from each other depending on what island they are in. Now, this is a picture of a Galapagos tortoise. When Darwin was in the Galapagos, people told him that they could tell which island a tortoise came from just by the shape of its shell. And later, this information would make him enlightened. So that is why he will later formalized the theory of evolution. Now, this is the tree of life. Maybe on that time, Darwin thought the today's species are descended from older or extinct species types. If so, then all species are connected to one another in a family tree, just like what we have here in the picture. It is a crude, simple sketch, but Darwin's drawing is a radical new picture of life, meaning that the ancestors is one species, and then later on, as time passed by, it would create branches and create new species. So that is why Darwin called this the tree of life. There was much discussion by immediate predecessors and contemporaries of Darwin about how the divine design model did not mesh well with observation of the extremes of variation among species. The idea of extinct species represented in the fossil record and functional similarities between the anatomy of extremely divergent species. The idea that evolution occurs, thus, was in the air at the time. In population limits that would allow selection to act naturally were recognized. Malthus, or Thomas Malthus, wrote the most influential works on this subject, and mathematically, populations will grow geometrically if unchecked. Food supplies rarely can be expected to grow faster than arithmetically, thus putting a limit on population growth. Thomas Malthus believed that without death, any species would quickly overrun Earth, but animal populations tend to hold steady. That's because huge numbers of young die every generation, meaning massive death plus variation. Thus, species with variations that give slight edge to survive, reproduce, and in time outnumber those without the advantage. But Thomas Malthus was focused on human populations that are checked or are held in check by famine, diseases, and death. That is also the case in nature. Artificial selection. It was well known that domesticated animals and plants had been bred over centuries by humans to produce different varieties. It indicates that the characteristics of a species can be modified by selection. Some examples of this selection or artificial selection includes different breeds of dogs, wild cabbage, lineage of cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, collards, kale, and more. Now, this is a Galapagos finches, but um, this finches had undergone natural selection instead of artificial selection. Recalls Darwin's theological training. Darwin was well aware of the impact that a workable, testable theory of evolution would have and the intense controversy and scrutiny it would draw. So, although he worked out most of his theory of evolution shortly after his trip on the Beagle, he spent 20 years accumulating evidences and doing experiments before finally publishing the idea. And the person who made Charles Darwin publish the idea was Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin was spurred on to publish when Alfred Russel Wallace shared his independent work where he had reached similar conclusions to Darwin. They first presented the theory of evolution by natural selection together in 1858. Even though Charles Darwin had his voyage in the HMS Beagle and Alfred Russel Wallace had his voyage on a different scenario, both of them together but separately, they both had the same explanation and the same conclusion to the theory of evolution. That is why Darwin was immediately prompted to publish his books entitled On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection because Alfred Russel Wallace had already got the idea about the theory of evolution aside from Darwin. But they together presented the theory by art in 1858. Now this is a picture of the massive Amazon river system. Next is this is the Malay archipelago, in which Alfred Russel Wallace was able to spend years researching about different invertebrates, especially about butterflies. This is his favorite butterfly, the golden birdwing butterfly. And this is the Wallace line. It is, as you can see, it is a formal boundary or boundary line drawn in 1859 by the British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace that separates the biogeographical realms of Asia and Wallacea. It is a transitional zone between Asia and Australia. Alfred Russel Wallace have seen that on this side, animals resembles marsupials, just like what we have in Australia. And in this side, animals resembles monkeys, just like what we had in the mainland Asia. Even though they're closely related under the Malay archipelago, these areas have different types of animals. And Wallace thought that because this side is closer to Australia, that is why animals or marsupial animals could easily could easily dominate these different areas. They came from Australia, and which was closer to this side. While on this side, which is closer to the mainland Asia, the animals here resembles monkeys because monkeys could easily dominate this part and would easily travel. And so he named this boundary the Wallace line. Next is Darwin published his first version of the book on the origin of species by means of natural selection in 1859. It took him 20 years or more for him to actually finish writing or to finally publish his books after the voyage on the HMS Beagle. In it, he laid out the entire argument with all the evidence that he had been gathering ever since his voyage on the Beagle. Darwin's book had immediate and dramatic impact. The force of this argument and evidence convinced many scientists quickly. Of course, it stirred tremendous controversy as well. Darwin made several revisions of his work in response to some of the most reasonable criticisms. He also focused on human evolution in the descent of man. Next is we have Darwin's theory: evolution occurs by natural selection. We have the objective: describe the logical reasoning behind Darwin's concept of natural selection. Darwin's theory of evolution was based on four general observations. We have overproduction, variation, competition, differential reproductive success, and natural selection will produce a population of individuals more suited to their environment through time. So natural selection, it is the process through which populations of living organisms adapt and change. Individuals in a population are naturally variable, meaning that they are all different in some ways. And this variation means that some individuals have traits better suited to the environment than others. And those individuals who are better adapted and better suited in the environment as compared to others would likely survive and pass these traits to the next generation. That is natural selection. We have explained the terms microevolution and macroevolution in their true scientific meanings and describe how microevolution can lead to macroevolution. Two major branches are microevolution, or the changes of a population over time, and macroevolution, or the formation of species. Microevolution is a small scale variation of allele frequencies in the gene pool of species. Example, it is the changes in the colors or the sizes of an animal or an organism. And microevolution, in microevolution, the new individuals are still considered of the same species as their ancestors. And a microevolution changes or produce descendants that are in the same taxonomic group or which are classified in the same species. And this does not result in speciation or formation of new species, meaning that organisms can breed with their ancestors because of minimal changes, and that is microevolution. But in macroevolution, it is the variation in allele frequencies at or above species level. Macroevolution produces a whole new species rather than just small changes within a species. It involves looking at large scale changes in evolution. Example, the origin of mammals, the separation of aquatic and terrestrial animals, and the evolution of humans. Macroevolutionary changes occur due to an accumulation of microevolutionary changes. So, in macroevolution, it results in speciation, meaning there is a change in species already. that the ancestors and the new generation would not be able to breed because of very large difference in their allele frequencies that caused a different species to form, unlike in microevolution. Next is evidence supporting the theory of evolution. Now, this is how butterflies mimic their surroundings or mimic their other types or other species of butterflies for them to survive and for them to not be able to be eaten by predators. Next is it is a cute caterpillar mimic the snake or the snake head so that this caterpillar will not be eaten by larger animals and would survive because these larger animals would think that these caterpillars are snakes. Now, this is a mimicry in snakes in which the Arizona mountain king snake at the top and the Arizona coral snake at the bottom looks similar or they mimic each other. Next is we have the evidence supporting the theory of evolution. We have the fossil record, comparative anatomy of related species. Next is distribution of plants and animals. Related species have similar patterns of development and molecular comparison among organisms. Evidence supporting the theory of evolution, the fossil records. Fossils provide direct evidence for change over time. Fossils range from mineralized cast or imprints, most commonly of bone, teeth, and shells, but sometimes of softer tissues, to actual body parts preserved in bugs, tar, amber, or ice. This is an example of a fossil as direct evidence for change over time. Okay. Next is how to date fossils or dating fossils. Relative position in rock layers. Sedimentary layers most commonly have the youngest layers near the surface and are progressively older as you go deeper. From the oldest layer that was maybe eventually formed billions or millions of years ago until to the latest layers which eventually formed thousands or hundreds of years ago. Next is dating fossils, associated with index fossils that have been dated by other means from other locations. We have radiometric dating. Each radioisotope has characteristics constant rate of decay. Some allow for measurement of when a rock was formed and when an organism died. Next is organs or structures that have similar form due to a common evolutionary origin are called homologous features. Example, the similarity between the human arm, the dolphin's flipper, the bat's wings, and the bird's wing. Example, plant leaves, cactus needles, flower sepals, and petals. Now we have vestigial structures. It is a feature that once had a role in the evolutionary history of a species, but that no longer function. In natural selection, it will logically lead to degeneration of unused features. That is why vestigial structures are remnants of those parts that have no more impact to what we are now. Some examples or some traits of the vestigial traits in humans include ear wiggling muscles, the tail, the appendix, and the wisdom tooth or the wisdom teeth. Biogeography, it is the study of the past and present geographical distribution of organisms. Organisms on islands are most closely related in form and genetically to those from the nearest mainland, not those from similar islands in different parts of the world. Just like what we had in the Wallace line, which differs in animal forms, in which in the eastern side would likely resembles marsupials, and on the eastern side would likely resembles monkeys because they are closer to the mainland Asia. And on the eastern side, because they are closely related to Australia, in which the animals in Australia are like marsupials, examples kangaroos, which have pockets. Next is related species that have similar patterns of development. Very young embryos of reptiles, birds, mammals, and humans are indistinguishable. Studies of developmental biology are revealing the common genetic basis for such similarities. The DEVO or EVO study is one of the hottest fields in biology today. Next objective is discuss how DNA sequence comparisons and molecular clocks work. The big test for the theory of evolution by natural selection was this. Evolution by natural selection on inherited traits predicts that genetic sequence information will provide a record of evolutionary change and evolutionary relationships. Evolution has passed this test with flying colors. The virtual universality of the genetic code is compelling evidence of a common ancestor. Changes in proteins and nucleic acids provide a record of evolutionary change. Changes in protein and nucleic acids provide a record of evolutionary change. The DNA sequencing provides a means to measure genetic similarities and differences between species. DNA and protein sequencing can be used to create a phylogenetic tree. It is a diagram showing the relatedness between species and the line of descent. DNA sequencing can also be used in some cases as a molecular clock to make some inference about when any two species diverged from each other, last shared a common ancestor. Example: humans and chimpanzees 98% sequence identity diverged about 6 million years ago. So what we have here is the human chromosome 2 and its analogous in the apes. The apes or examples are chimpanzees. They have 24 pairs of chromosomes, while humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Now, scientists believe that there was a variation, there was a mutation, there was a change or there was a chromosomal abnormality that eventually led to the separation between the humans and the chimp or the apes. And the scientists found that it was in chromosome number 2, where the chimp chromosome 2p and 2q are connected or was basically formed or and then basically form the human chromosome 2. That is why the apes have 24 pairs while the humans have 23 pairs. And humans and apes basically have 98% sequence identity. Next is modern synthesis. What is modern synthesis? Although Mendel was a contemporary of Darwin, remember that his work was largely unrecognized until around 1900s. How traits are inherited was central to Darwin's theory of evolution. Thus, Darwin and others were keenly interested in finding working models of inheritance. When genetic mechanisms came to be widely understood, they were quickly combined with Darwin's model in the modern synthesis, also called Neo-Darwinism or the synthetic theory of evolution. This model emphasizes the genetics of populations. Evolution is seen as working by natural selection or on individuals to change the genetic makeup of populations over successive generations. Mutations play a key role in providing a source of genetic variation. Without genetic variation, evolution cannot occur. Mutations are necessary to produce genetic variation. While many mutations have no impact and many others are harmful, it is critical to recognize that some mutations are advantageous. Now, the last one is the central role of evolution in modern biology. The modern synthetic theory of evolution is accepted today by most biologists as a robust and well supported model. The central framework for the study of life, and nearly all biologists today agree with a famous statement by the evolutionary geneticist T. Dubzhansky. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Studies of evolution itself today focus largely on the causal processes of evolution, such as the speed of evolutionary change, the role of change or the role of chance in evolution, molecular comparisons between and within species by comparing DNA sequences, comparing genomes, and comparing proteins and proteomes. Now that is the end of our discussion. I hope that you learned something from our presentation. Again, this is Shira Lensei Tidasera, and I would like to say thank you for listening.